sir. I am your host today, and I shall be beginning this lecture with a little introduction, if that is okay. All right. Good evening to one and all. I am Obhinandita, your host for this lecture, and you'll have to bear with me for just a little while. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, which is our humble attempt as undergraduate and postgraduate students to transform subaltern studies in little ways, it is a heartfelt honor to welcome you all to today's much anticipated lecture titled Dispossession, Ecocide, and Militarism. Dr. Akhtar is a distinguished scholar, activist, and public intellectual whose work bridges the worlds of academia and grassroots politics engagement in a rare depth and sincerity. He is currently serving as an associate professor of political economy at Quaid-i-Azam University, Islamabad, where where he has been a long and passionate educator who is committed to generations of students. Trained at some of the world's finest institutions, including the London School of Economics, the University of London, Dr. Akhtar brings together the analytical rigour of the social sciences with a deep ethical commitment to social justice. His research spans a wide range of themes, including the political economy of Pakistan, class formation, imperialism, urbanisation, and everyday experiences of marginalised communities in South Asia. His book, The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan, effectively amalgamates his academic and activist insights to initiate a scholarly dialogue on an alternative to neoliberal militarized post-colonial capitalism in Pakistan. Here, Akhtar meticulously deploys to determine abstractions that remain linked to concrete historical reference. He is also the author of the acclaimed book, The Politics of Common Sense, State, Society, and Culture, in which he celebrates the nuance of consent and resistance in post colonial Pakistan. His powerful work is never confined to the page, though. He has been actively involved in progressive politics and popular movements in Pakistan for over 2 decades, working closely with peasants, laborers, students. His work is that of a critic, and he brings in hope and possibility, which is a rare combination in our times. In both his scholarship and activism recites power, and he offers us frameworks to rethink power, history, and collective struggle with compassion, clarity, and conviction. As an introduction to his lecture, I quote Faiz: "Look, the mountains of the locks are beginning to open, the links of the chains are coming undone. Speak, the little time before your body and tongue give out. It's enough. Speak, truth is still alive. Speak, say whatever you wish you had said." Thank you.
Great. Does that mean it's time for me to speak?
Yes, sir. Kindly continue.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Probably a bit too kind. And also for inviting me to speak to you today. I honestly wasn't familiar with this collective, but it was a pleasure to get an email and to have a few exchanges with all of you and to arrange this discussion. Ideally, because being on the other side of this border, we get to hear very little or engage very little with people on that side. So ideally, I'd like to be able to do some of that today. I'm not sure whether that's part of how you're structuring this session. So I'll say my piece, and then maybe or hopefully there will be an opportunity for us to have a little bit of back and forth, because for me this is as much about learning and getting a sense from you. Wherever you may be in India. I'm assuming all of you are in India, or maybe some of this collective is based outside of India as well. But this is an opportunity for me. I look at it as an opportunity to also become, despite the fact that we are so close, we're that far away. And of course, I say that not just in general, in reference to the last 80 years, but of course also in reference to what has just passed. in the month of May between our two countries, which I guess it's fair to say has set us all back, or at least people like ourselves would say has set us all back. Of course, there's a large segment of both of our populations who are still in some kind of celebratory mood about having banished the other to some, historical defeat. And those sort of wars on social media that have engulfed far too many of our young people, I think, is part of what I would like to address today. And despite the differences, I'll come to this, but despite the differences in our respective histories, since the British left the subcontinent and left us divided into different nation states, despite whatever differences the two countries have or the different trajectories the two countries have followed, my feeling is, and my argument would be, that in fact we are much closer to one another than certainly our official histories and our sort of official narratives of the state would suggest, and also I think to some extent the academic treatises have suggested, especially when it comes to sort of this broader signifier of Pakistan having largely been an undemocratic or a state that has not experienced democracy, whereas India has. And I think I would like to problematize some of that. So some of, in a sense, when we were trying to work out in a couple of email exchanges what I might speak about today, what I tried to do really was to, in a sense, bring together the very many different themes that were suggested to me as possible titles for today's talk. And you'll see that in the title of the talk, there's three words that I've put in there, which I believe can bridge many different sort of interrelated themes. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you see the world, I tend to think or theorize in somewhat what the original, I think, turn, whether we call it the linguistic turn or the postmodern turn in the early 80s, of which the Subaltern Studies School then became affiliated or associated at some point, at least, if not initially. I am still very much a fan of theorizing in the grand, in the sense that I think of things as a totality, society and the world, even different scales of analysis, I think, are possible to bring together in ways that do not reduce any particular scale or, in a sense, privilege any particular classificatory category, whether it be class or empire or the state. So, the three terms that I've asked us to think about today, dispossession, ecocide, and militarism, I think capture for me and bring together, in a sense, the regimes or the developmental regimes, the political economic regimes, the ideological regimes that I think persist in large parts of our region. I won't speak beyond that. I think it's significant or sufficiently difficult to try and to think about our region as a whole. And as you noted in the introduction, I think another way of thinking about these three themes, or another way of, in a sense, bringing these three themes together, is to think around in the conceptual framework of post-colonial capitalism. So what I want to suggest to you is that we live in an era, or we live in times, not, of course, that just these times and time and temporality, I think, for me, is something that we also need to think very, very critically about in our very hyper-digitalized present. But we live in times where, the particular regime of accumulation that persists and that has in some ways taken shape across our region, across both of our countries, across other countries in the region, arguably in many other parts of the world as well, is one, I think, founded upon these three interrelated, in a sense, in political and economic forms. The aspects of dispossession, ecocide, and militarism, I think, cannot be separated. And so if we start, or if we think through this as a historical phenomenon, and as I said, if you sort of as a preface, you start from the premise rather that we exist within a system that we call post-colonial capitalism, then I think what we would want to do, and what I have done in my work, and what I think a lot of critical scholars have also done in India, is to think about what is unique about this particular conjuncture that we can currently inhabit, and arguably, to take another sort of conceptual idea that has been used globally, also a term that I heard you use in the introduction, neoliberalism. If we sort of conform to that particular historical conjuncture and we say, okay, in the neoliberal era, how has the post-colonial capitalist accumulation regime evolved? And of course, there's a lot of work that has tried to capture this phenomenon from a particularly post-colonial and even South Asian perspective. And I think what we'll find is, first of all, importantly, that it's not sufficient for us to think as in sort of a binary way about state and market, or state and capital more generally. In all of the work that I've tried to, all of my thinking about stuff over a period of many years, what I've found, and partly that's because of, as you mentioned, some of my experience as a political organizer, what I found is that state and capital are very difficult to separate. Conceptually, we do so for good reason. But in practice, in terms of the accumulation regime, the regime that gives rise to dispossession and ecocide, and is essentially a militaristic regime, the nexus of state and capital, I think, is a more useful way of thinking about how this regime is prosecuted, how it is sustained, or what is the modality through which this regime is articulated. So unlike sort of, in a sense, the dominant conceptualization of neoliberalism, especially in Western critical theory and even Western sort of critical debates around the evolution of, or let's say the collapse of the welfare state, and the shift towards the market, the implication being that somehow state and market, or at least a welfare state apparatus, and the state as sort of a state with an economic role, which seeks to, in a sense, give some, or at least create some disincentive, or at least to regulate capital in the service of labor, which is the way this historical story in the main has panned out in Western Europe and North America, and other parts of what we erstwhile called the First World, and today is generally referred to as the Global North. And that state apparatus and an apparatus of welfarism and sort of larger political compact where labor was able to articulate a compromise with capital, that then gave way under neoliberalism to a thoroughly weakened sort of labor and a restoration of what David Harvey calls the restoration of class power. But for me, I think, whether or not I see this to be the case in the so-called global north, but in South Asia, I would say it's the restoration of class power. And I would say in a sense, the reinforcement of colonial statecraft, which never really in a sense, went away. And in fact, even at the best of times, I mean, India and Pakistan in this sense depart from one another to an extent. Even at the best of times, when India, when sort of the Nehruvian state was at its highest, in a sense, in articulation and sort of the Fabian socialism that the Nehruvian state represented. Even at the best of times, this was a welfare state apparatus, which arguably, I would say, was offset at the very least, and at worst was overshadowed by the other side of the state apparatus, the repressive apparatus, the colonial apparatus, the apparatus which subjugated its peripheries as it continues to do today. So for me, I think the story of the neoliberal conjuncture, or post-colonial capitalism in the neoliberal conjuncture, is less sort of a departure from a prosaic state versus market binary, and more the articulation of a new phase of a state-capital nexus, or a evolved phase of a state-capital nexus, away from what we saw with some kind of sort of emphasis on industrialization and the national bourgeoisie being the subject of at least some kind of challenge to imperialist capital, and that being reflected in, as I said, some kind of Fabian socialist developmental regime, with a certain again compact which allowed labor and the left in India certainly some space, parliamentary communism being the most obvious example. Of course, the situation was different in Pakistan, where even this modicum of, in a sense, political and economic space for the left, for labor, for the historically disenfranchised, for what in our context on the left we call the oppressed nations, which in your context would be the Northeast or Kashmir or what have you. So it may have been slightly different in Pakistan, but nevertheless, I think the nexus of state and capital is a more useful way of thinking about how this historical regime has evolved. So if there was some, in a sense, balancing act that the developmental state, or so-called developmental state, or the third world nationalist state, or the state that was inspired by Bandung and what Adam Getachew has called the idea of world making, or a new world, where the third world was to an extent a unified actor. The articulation of some of the imperative of structural change to break free of what Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism, where all of that then existed up till, let's say, the 1980s, which then infamously is ripped away by, in India it's Manmohan Singh in 1991, and in Pakistan it's probably even earlier, with the onset of structural adjustment programs around 1987, even while Ziaul Haq was alive. And that sort of the pretense that there could be and that there was an aspiration or horizon, political and economic horizon, in which colonialism was named, and there were attempts, however limited, to break free from that inheritance, even if, as I said, they were offset by the actual practical sort of operative logic of statecraft and the nexus between state and capital even back in the day. Nevertheless, that sort of political settlement, to use Mushtaq Khan's language, was certainly more progressive than what we've seen develop subsequently. And what I want to suggest to you about dispossession, ecocide, and militarism is that we always saw, even at the best of times, with import substitution, industrialization, and third world nationalist sort of projects, there was always, with the Green Revolution, for instance, and the imperative of using surplus from agriculture to industrialize and to create a strong industrial, but it was always accompanied by dispossession. It was always accompanied by displacement. It was always accompanied by some forms of class war or caste war or war by the core regions against the peripheries. But there was nevertheless an offsetting, in a sense. There was nevertheless a double movement, if we think in terms of Polanyi, where at the same time you had industry absorbing those who were displaced or dispossessed from agriculture, where you had some pretense that these historic peripheries at different junctures in our different countries were slightly enfranchised, were given a little bit more constitutional recognition. In Pakistan's case, that happened mostly in the early 1970s, where anywhere from Balochistan to Gilgit-Baltistan were given new political, in a sense, constitutional, in a sense, places inside the Pakistani Federation. And so, whether it be absorbing the mass of the population that is being displaced from agriculture on account of sort of modernization from above, or it be some sense of enfranchisement, dispossession we certainly didn't call it dispossession in the way we call dispossession today. I think that scale was limited. I think, as I said, there was a double movement. There was an offsetting that revolved around that sort of relatively more empowered labor and the left, and what we would call subaltern classes more generally. And what we've seen is the unhinging of both a new kind of globalized capital in the neoliberal conjuncture, and also an unhinging of state power, where the state has completely reneged on whatever limited historical welfarist responsibility that it once claimed, whether it be in the name of Nehruvian socialism or it be in the name of import substitution or whatever, whether it be in the name of some kind of third world sort of economic imperative. The state has completely reneged on that. And the state has done so willfully, not just because global creditors and the IMF have demanded it, but because as Harvey's term suggests, the property dominant classes were held in check by the compact of the 60s and the 70s, and by the class assertion from below, and by popular movements. They were held in check. They were forced to compromise in ways, and the state was an articulation. The welfare state, again, however limited, was an articulation of that compromise. But since the state capital nexus that has come into existence from the 90s onwards is unhinged. It cares little for the pretense of welfare. Yes, we've seen, very famous theorists, like, for instance, Partha Chatterjee, argue that this conjuncture has been characterized by a politics of the governed, where the governed do have agency and they do articulate, some, in a sense, demands popular, a form of politics in what he calls political society, which is certainly not to be dismissed. And of course, there's no question of dismissing any kind of subaltern agency. But in contrast to sort of Chatterjee's argument, or even sort of closer to home, how Kalyan Sanyal has theorized post-colonial capitalism, I think that the absence of collective organized power from below is conspicuous by its absence, or its erosion, or its fragmentation, let's say. And that's not to dismiss everyday forms of resistance at all, not in the least. I would be the last person to do so, because I spent much of my life trying to make common cause with those everyday forms. But it would be remiss to suggest that, the political settlement or the political power exercise from below, or the kind of alternative imaginaries and visions that I think animated politics and the political mainstream included, not just sort of fringe elements of society who call themselves the left or who call themselves progressives, or who clearly articulate that they take sides in history, but even in the mainstream. I think that is the neoliberal conjuncture is conspicuous for the fact that form of collective organized power or imaginary is now absent, is now missing. And that's not to romanticize, the socialist imaginaries of the 20th century, but just to name explicitly that kind of imaginary is now absent. And I think that's why the unhinging of the state capital nexus, a financialized capital, a globalized capital, a capital that now, along with the state, no longer is concerned with or cares for any kind of absorption of the surplus populations that are being dispossessed, that are being pushed out of an agrarian sector that, of course, long has been unable to meet the needs of the vast majority of people, both agriculturalists and non-agriculturalists, across different caste divides, in societies that are, in which large numbers of the labor force actually still rely on that sector for their livelihoods, and where in the past we saw some kind of industrial policy that sought, as I said, to do so, to accommodate those who were displaced. Now it's not only the fact that does not happen, and in Sanyal's work, for instance, we see that large numbers of those people are compelled to work in what we call the informal economy, where they are eking out a subsistence, where many of them are self-employed. But in fact, the number and scale of dispossession has in fact increased manifold. And that's because the regime of accumulation, or post-colonial capitalism, and this goes back to the British period, where, sort of the regime that the British instituted in India, and I mean all of India, of course, colonial India, was one that Imran Ali in the Pakistan, in the context of Indian Punjab, called it hydraulic society, but that was true of both the Indus Basin and the Gangetic Basin. This was a regime that privileged, or that was based on the dominant technologies or the logics of, the conquest of nature. And this is where I'll come to the ecocide part of the story of its time, where, land was a resource to generate raw materials, and you needed sources of water, and of course, technologies of perennial irrigation to make land arable, to generate raw materials. And you built the railways, and you created the port cities so that you could take all of that raw material. And that's why we know today India was looted to the tune of 45 trillion pounds, which is probably an underestimate. But even that sort of regime now has, in a sense, developed more tentacles. Parts of the subcontinent, like where the heavily forested regions of central and northeast India, where the tribals populations live, Balochistan and Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan, which were considered just strategic frontiers, but dry, in a sense, economically unproductive. It is these regions, it is the minerals under these forests, it is what previously water bodies that were not considered sufficiently proximate to, potentially arable land, to think about how, or to just render those water resources a source of value or a source of profit. Now everything is fair game. Minerals, forests, water bodies, everything's fair. In fact, it is this ravenous appetite to conquer all and everything that nature offers, to conquer, the glaciers of Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, and both Kashmirs, of Ladakh, to conquer the coastlines of Balochistan, which some of you will know is a heavily brutalized periphery in Pakistan, where an insurgency of extremely high intensity, increasingly high intensity insurgency, the fifth of its kind, is currently ongoing. And so I think what in one of the books that I wrote, I called it the new colonialism, a colonialism that now has expanded frontiers of what you can colonize, what parts of nature are still left to be colonized. The previously dry, unproductive sort of wastelands, of course, the British always call, just like our states still call any parts that that you cannot bring into the circuits of capital, they call it wasteland. They call deserts wasteland, even if people live in those deserts, even if people grow, chanas in those deserts, they still think of its wasteland. So everything that can be conquered is up for conquest. And the state capital nexus does it together. It doesn't just happen that, the Adanis or the Ambanis do it, but the state facilitates it. It doesn't just happen that, Chilean and Canadian copper companies or multinationals come into Balochistan to pillage copper and gold mines. It's the state that facilitates. So the state capital nexus, which existed in the era of high developmentalism, in the era of third worldism, now has become unhinged. And alongside expanding the scale of dispossession and rendering more and more people surplus and not even absorbing them into sort of new emergent, forms of, so let's say development that at least have some offsetting impact. Instead, what we are seeing is that large, millions and millions are dispossessed, and all of our natural resources are up for grabs. And this is something that was theorized by Rosa Luxemburg more than 100 years ago. Capital always seeks and always needs to have an outside to conquer, to create new markets, to generate, to be able to sustain its wasteful sort of energy needs. And of course, as we know now, critical minerals is the new frontier of green capitalism as well. So even if you green it, it still features a particular kind of dispossession and ecocide. To move to militarism, I think this is very important for us sitting across these nation-state boundaries. I remember it's probably now 10 or 15 years ago when a series of literature emerged, critical literature emerged from India about the Red Corridor, about the Naxalite movement in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and so on. And there was, I remember, maybe it was Arundhati's sort of journalistic piece where the euphemism amongst the Indian state, or at least the coercive state apparatus, that those regions which we cannot access, where the insurgency rages, is what they call Pakistan. It's like that in Balochistan, right? Where there is no, the dominant narrative doesn't allow or facilitate or tolerate the notion that this is that there are organic grievances, that people from below are not willing to tolerate dispossession and ecocide and colonial statecraft, and that it is all a raw conspiracy. And of course, this reached epic proportions last month. And this, I think, is the crux of the matter for me, because you and I, sitting across the screen, perhaps already share some basic principles of humanity and the aspirations for all humans to be free, for our colonial inheritance to be named for what it is and to be transcended, for this behemoth that we call capitalism to be transcended, and for the metabolic rift that it has given rise to for the human and nature metabolism that characterized almost hundreds of thousands of years of human history, of history before this, to be restored. But the truth is that we're a minority. And when you see episodes like you saw last month, that hits home. That becomes painfully apparent. That becomes so painfully apparent even because people who, for a long time in the preceding many years, who had been on the front lines with us, talking about oppressed nations or talking about the destruction of livelihoods and dispossession due to man-made disasters, like we had one in 2022 when the floods came in Sindh and Balochistan. People who had been opposing and speaking bravely against the ideologies of state that justify dispossession and ecocide, and which people on another side of the border are somehow all just easily decried as enemies, and even thinking otherwise critically minded people at times of war. I don't know whether one should call it that or whatever it was. It was too much, whatever it was. Tend to fall in line. And what really disturbs me, I think, about our present times is that we live in a world where political debate, expression, even sort of difficult conversations and complex matters are all reduced to memes and to tweets. And that can never do justice to this long history, some of which I've just very briefly gone over here. It's not possible to capture all of this in a sphere of debate that is increasingly dumbed down, where time and space are compressed, where the present is so dominant that you can neither talk about the past, let alone articulate a vision for the future, a putatively collective vision, a putatively shared vision. And for me, there's just no question about it. Whether I know you or whether I ever meet you or whether this is the only time we will engage over a screen, our futures are interlocked. We're certainly, maybe I'm a generation older than you, but certainly your futures, the futures of this enormously young region that we inhabit. It is the youngest region in the world. We are 2 billion, almost 2 billion people, and a billion and a quarter are under the ages of 25. And whether it's climate change or whether it's this militaristic sort of chest thumping and sort of imaginary victories in wars which implicate states and of course geopolitical rivalries, and I think that we are signing away our own futures by not thinking collectively and critically and recognizing that if the rise of the right in India is not something for me to be gleeful about. The persistence of military dominance in Pakistan is not something that young people in India are going to benefit from by making fun of online. And I think militarism is the dominant ideology of our age. And we see that, of course. We're seeing it right now with what Israel is doing in Iran, what they've done to the Palestinians for the best part of 2 years, forget 2 years, for 80 years. What we've seen in the Middle East, in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, what we see in our own peripheries, whether you see it in the Red Corridor in the Northeast or Kashmir, or we see it here in Balochistan or Sindh or Pakhtunkhwa. These are all truths. These are, Iqbal Ahmad used to say, The truth doesn't become stale because you've said it once. It has to be repeated again and again and again. And the more truth that we speak with and to each other and one another and across these boundaries, the better the chances are that we have some collective future. There's no way that a heat wave in Rajasthan is going to stop at the border and not come into Sindh. There's no way that glacier melt in Ladakh will not happen in Baltistan. These are just, there's no meme that will wish away these truths. There's no way that the developmental regime that generates dispossession and ecocide is going to affect Indian young workers in India differently than than it's affecting young workers in Pakistan. With, of course, acknowledging the different trajectories, acknowledging maybe that India's industrial sector and its very fetid pharmaceuticals and software sectors have created an economic miracle. Whatever that economic miracle looks like, it certainly doesn't benefit the large majority of Indian workers or peasants or tribals or low-caste people. And it's the same here. And I think that if we together are not able to name what post-colonial capitalism is, and the fact that it actually binds us together in ways that militaristic, nationalistic slogans obviously seek to gloss over, and that ultimately these are globalized regimes of capital, and that these coercive colonial state apparatuses are all in the service of, and that it is in the interests of the vast majority of people on both sides of our borders to recognize these realities for what they are and not be drawn to hate and militarism and name calling. Of course, this is not a horizon that is immediately achievable. I'm not naive. I've spent my whole life, doing this and being politically active and being an educator, and I don't have any reason to believe that we are better off now than we were some years ago. But I certainly don't think that we are necessarily worse off, or that there's no hope left at all. So I'll stop there. I'll stop with this thought, because I think that, as I said earlier, this is an opportunity for me also, if possible, if this is something that is within within the mandate that you've set yourself today, for me to also hear from you. And that's what I would like to do.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful lecture. Like you said, it was the need of the hour. We are, the memory and the consciousness of the collective future is fading away from us. We are losing our grip on it. And we are actually going live on YouTube. And we have a couple of questions which our viewers would like to ask you. So if I would request the organizer to copy paste the questions in the chat. And if you could open the chat. Yeah. We would be taking those questions now. Pallab, can you please copy paste the questions which we have received on YouTube Live?
Abhinandita, I just give the question. Please read the questions first, sir.
Sure, I can read it out. Given the sheer scale and entrenchment of militarism in the everyday, from occupied territories to borderland economies to urban policing, what does peace, in inverted commas, mean in the context of the subcontinent? Can a genuine people's future emerge from within such heavily securitized landscapes, or must it be built entirely outside and against them? It's an awesome question. I think that it is in the everyday, and it is in on the front lines of struggle, and of course, some of the most brutalized parts of the subcontinent, that you see all extremes. You see what Fanon would call hate at its most acute, uh, because when you are so brutalized, your imaginary of the other, of those who occupy, who colonize, cannot be anything but. But you also see articulations of, um, internationalism, of, at least putatively collective notions of politics. Um, I agree that peace as a signifier is, of course, insufficient to talk about peace in the abstract. Is insufficient, and I think this would require us to then enter more difficult terrain about, for instance, I've mentioned in this brief talk about, sort of armed forms of resistance, whether it be in India or Pakistan or anywhere else. And even today at the global scale, the kinds of debates some often unproductive debates that I see many of the people who I have known for a long time engage in, again, online, about sort of, around at the scale of geopolitics, where we're thinking, okay, well, this state, for instance, Zionism or imperialism, and then anyone that's on the other side of that, Zionism and imperialism, is automatically good, irrespective of how peaceful or unpeaceful, or whether maybe they engage in their developmental regimes that they champion are no less, in a sense, violent, or generate dispossession and ecocide of the ways the kinds that we've talked about. So I don't think it's a question of entirely outside and against. I think there's some of that for sure. But I do think from the inside, we have to continue to hold out, not just hope, but I think it's not just about some random, very liberal idea of hope. It's also to think about at least what I've observed in the many years that I've organized politically. I've never sort of confronted a sort of a situation of total darkness from within the everyday, from the most brutalized parts of places that I've been privileged to organize. So I think you're right that if that is your suggestion, that peace in the abstract is not something that I think that has very much meaning. I think for me, this is the old classic, if there's no justice, there is no peace. There will never be peace. There can't be a lasting peace. There can't be a peace that makes any sense. I do think strategically, of course, at different times, like last month, and this is somewhat separate from the particular question that you asked, but at certain times, strategically, I think it is important for those with political commitments, which of the kinds that I'm assuming that some of the people who are listening today share with me, to talk some language of peace, to oppose, for instance, war in the way that the war we saw last month was prosecuted on both sides. But peace in the abstract beyond that, with regimes of developmental or accumulation regimes that are so brutalizing, yes, I don't think that's very meaningful. I think the horizon is perhaps what I would say, a horizon of peace, where I want to get to. And that's very important, mind you. I talked very briefly about how that horizon, that shared horizon of the high point of, in a sense, the left or progressive politics or revolutionary movements in the 20th century, there was a horizon. Not, again, without romanticizing that horizon, there was the symbolism of the 20th century revolutions, the idea that people from below, the subalterns, the brutalized, the losers of history, could one day win and create something different, something new, something, um, whether we call it a classless society or whether we call it whatever. I think that is perhaps the signifier of peace operates usefully, potentially usefully there. Because there has to be something positive that we share, that we work towards. Everything today we've talked about is what we are against, and so. But that was important, I think, because it's important for us to realize across these borders that so much is the same. So much of this system generates the same kinds of miseries, and the next step would be, well, what do we want? What do we want to create? And I think that's essential. We have to do that. And maybe that's where the idea of peace could be useful. Do you want me to carry on and read the next question as well?
Right, I can read it for you. So,
Sure.
Orno Rokit is asking, how do we reconcile the narrative of national security with the persistent internal wars waged against indigenous communities, marginalized castes, and ecological defenders, often in the name of progress or stability? Can there truly be an alternative future without a moral reckoning with these histories of state violence and environmental collapse?
No, not at all. There cannot be a reckoning. I mean, there must be a reckoning, rather. There cannot be an alternative future. Um, we must confront the past and name what is the present, and the fact that the present is a continuity of that past. And whatever future we would build would also be a continuity of the present, which would then be the past. But in what ways would it change? How would it be? Where would the transcendence happen? Demands, therefore, that we think about the past and how we might break away from this. So certainly, I don't think that there's a question of just pretending that we can, as I say, talk a very liberal and bleeding heart liberal language of peace and be like, oh, we should all just come together as one. That's not just going to happen, because it shouldn't. As I said, there's no way that that's going to happen anyway, because the political odds are stacked against us, right? Because it is young people like yourselves, not you necessarily, but you know this, I don't need to tell you this, many who are on the front lines of these propaganda wars, right? Who are speaking the language of the state, who are speaking the language of, that for instance, Muslims are agents of Pakistan, right? Just like Baloch are agents of India, right? The parallels are so stark. It's remarkable, right? It's just that's what we can do. We can speak this critique. We can share this critique. We can name this history of violence, and we can continue to talk about it being not just a history of the past, but an ongoing lived history of the present. And therefore, that is the moral reckoning. And however, is it sort of chronological? Is it the temporality that we must beat this and then no, not at all. Just like the first question, where the question of from within the everyday, there must be from within. We must, even now, even in the midst of, part of this moral reckoning is to continuously project or to say, even if we don't know what it looks like, even if I can't say, like, revolutionaries in the 20th century said, oh, well, what do we want to do? We want to do what the Russian revolutionaries did, or, however prosaic that might have been. Even if we don't have a model, and I certainly don't, believe you me, I don't think there's any country out there in the world. Yes, there are certainly countries that I feel inspired by, and I still feel like I like to talk about Cuba, and I still think it's worth talking about Cuba. Not because Cuba is the perfect image of what I think we can or would want to build, but because principles of human solidarity, or self-conscious, both self and collective consciousness, where you choose to say, okay, I'm being boxed in and driven to hunger by an embargo by the most powerful country on the planet, but I still choose to stand with this system that I've created, however flawed it might be. I think that there must be stuff that we can talk about that harkens to this future. So it can't just be that the temporality is first we beat We have this moral reckoning with the past, with our histories of what you're calling state violence and environmental collapse, and then only, no, I think it must be contemporaneous. And, partly it's by talking to each other like this. And I think this certainly is something that I find to be very inspiring, to know, okay, well, we can do this in the midst of all of this. And hopefully it will be the same for you.
Okay. As for our next question, Rakhi Mundal is asking, in a subcontinent where the vocabulary of development has become synonymous with extractive practices and militarized zones, how can we meaningfully reimagine a future for its people without first confronting? Okay, wait, there's another question, but I'll finish the question first. Okay. Yeah. How can we meaningfully reimagine a future for its people without first confronting the systemic complicity of both democratic institutions and civil society in sustaining dispossession and ecocide? Is resistance possible without a radical dismantling of the very foundations of state legitimacy?
Yeah, this is a question I think that maybe certainly I think it would trouble me more if I lived in India than in Pakistan, because of this, romanticizing about the world's biggest democracy, and we've never had a military, and oh, we're not like Pakistan, this terrorist state that is just run by generals, which is maybe true, but that's for me to say. And in India, this sort of perpetual, sort of self-referential, and then some of these really awful, like the world's biggest democracy and the world's oldest democracy, like, hanging out with Trump and doing business with the Pentagon is really a democratic victory. So certainly, I think that's, again, look, for me, all of these challenges, all of these political imperatives, all of these, in a sense, both ideological and theoretical and practical questions, I think, there's nothing in what you are asking me that I would disagree with. But, again, I will say to you, like I've said to the first couple of questions, when you ask, how can we meaningfully reimagine a future without first, this chronology, the temporality, the question of temporality, I think is very important. Like, if you think, I don't know if you're exposed to Walter Benjamin, but certainly, Benjamin's ways of thinking about time. So, Benjamin says, there is no catastrophe out there. The catastrophe is now. The status quo is the catastrophe. We're not waiting for collapse to happen. It is in the essence of how the system works. It is, by definition, it brutalizes it. It creates, we called it divide and rule, or define and rule with the British, like that's what we used to say, right? And not used to say, it's still a fairly good, apt, sort of, at least insofar as 3 words can summarize a system of colonial sort of rule. But, it's important to remember that is something that has persisted for now hundreds of years and persists even today. I'm not sure that, and under the guise of, democracy and so on, called civil society. I mean, painfully, the entire the entire critical Western philosophical sort of debate on civil society is completely absent. Civil society is terms that are used by Hegel and Marx and Gramsci. Of course, the way that the mainstream uses civil society is completely different. But aside from that sort of digression, all I would say is resistance possible? Of course, resistance is possible. I actually think for me, this might take us into a different train. I think simply thinking in the terms of resistance is what I would like to problematize. I think resistance is necessary, but resistance is not sufficient. What is sufficient is a theorization of a revolutionary politics for our times. And some of our conceptual vocabulary does not allow that, right? So this was not the time for me to get into it, but you did mention the last book I wrote, and a lot of that was about the digital. The digital has really, really changed things up, and really something that I think people like ourselves need to be more, sort of in a sense, critically conscious of and think more about, because of the ways in which it's shaping political debate, discussion, and even critical theory. And often, unfortunately, so many people ostensibly on the same side of the fence are just engaged in these unproductive online debates. So I do think that, there a radical dismantling of the very foundations of state legitimacy. All of this is part and parcel of the same, I think, emancipatory project. We have to be able to name and think about what that project is. In India, it'll have slightly different contours. In Pakistan, it'll have slightly different contours. But we need to have the theoretical foundations where we recognize that it is the same struggle. It's not different. We're not trying to do something radically different from one another. And I think that is the kind of sort of mass, in a sense, consent that I would want to build, right? An alternative hegemony that I would want to posit, right? Where we are able to speak to these brutalized young people who become the purveyors of hate and militarism and articulate something different. I just don't think I think making it chronological is I think what I would ask you to think critically about. I think to do it contemporaneously, however, sometimes futile that might seem. And of course, for us, it often is banging our heads against the wall. But then we go back to history and we say, well, a lot of people banged their heads against the wall for a long, long time. And you don't have to be there to see the results of your banging your head against the wall. You just have to set in motion, along with others like yourself, a train of events that maybe somewhere down the line will allow us to realize those shared imaginaries. So certainly not just resistance, but thinking about systemic and change at a big scale, rather than just thinking, well, we want to resist at every juncture. We do, but we want to do more than that also. And to do that alongside our critique and our dismantling and our sort of, in a sense, bringing to light all of the truths that I said we have to keep repeating.
That is so important. And like you said, in our era of the digital, it becomes all the more difficult to build that, mass consent, and that to set forth that event towards, because public opinion then becomes so complicated, and as youngsters who are not sometimes there at the grassroots, it's become so confusing, and so, there's disillusionment all around us. So, absolutely. One last question, sir. This is from Muma Al Majhi. How might we theorize resistance when the language of emancipation itself, development, rights, reform, is already co opted within the same biopolitical and necropolitical logics that sustain ecological devastation and militarized extraction? Is the call for an alternative future merely a rhetorical displacement of critique? Or can it rupture the temporal and spatial grammar of colonial modernity that still governs life and death in the subcontinent? I feel like somewhat you have answered this question, but if you would further like to
No,
reflect on whatever.
I'll say it
Yeah.
again and again and again, as long as we're online and talking to one another. Yes, of course, I think that it can. Um, Look, I'm intellectually pessimistic. Yeah, I'm not trying to pretend that we should just be, singing about milk and honey because, that's sort of the right thing to do. There's nothing in what all of these very brilliant questions are suggesting to me that tells me that we differ greatly in our understanding of the situation that we confront, in the structural logics of what we confront, capital and colonial statecraft and sort of the conquest of nature, the modernities, sort of the idea that humans who once, for most of our history, we looked at nature in Urdu. It's called, we use the same word for nature and for God, right? Qudrat, and Qudrat is something bigger than us. And all of a sudden, one day, the white man came around and told us, no, we can conquer it all. And We can make it. We can make the river flow according to our needs, and not have our settlements be made redundant because the river flows on its own. Um, and all of that I share, and I share your and when I use this word skepticism, I use it, I think, in a way that is very laudatory. That is necessary. Ruthless. Marx would call it a ruthless criticism of everything existing, and that is something to do, to ask, and to say, well, is this alternative future business really not just, as you say, a rhetorical displacement? I'm willing to hear that question, because I can see where it comes from. Just like the question about, well, what is this democracy business, or what is this civil society business? What are all of these words? Yes, you're right. But does that means maybe we need a new vocabulary? We need to adapt our vocabulary? Whatever it is, we can do it. And I think as long as there are people out there who are willing to continue, sort of, in a sense, as I said, recovering these and naming these shared histories, in all of both their misery, but also in the fact that it is in these histories that we still find, the voices of people and forests and water and land, and it is still, it's not as if it's all just doom and gloom, right? There's still something that compels us all to come back and think and talk and engage and try harder, even if we don't have. So I don't think that it's a rhetorical displacement. I would like to believe it's not a rhetorical displacement. That's up to you to determine. But it's certainly something. I'm actually making an appeal, right? I'm not saying that I know what that alternative future looks like. In a sense, the 20th century, it was easier to be a revolutionary, to be on the left in the 20th century, because you just had to say, oh, I want to be like that. Oh, I just want to be on that side of this global conflict, and that sort of will equate to progressive, which of course is no longer sufficient, right? We can see that, I think. It's certainly not sufficient for me. Just to give you some context, like some of the debates that have taken place in Pakistan, even in progressive circles in the last month, have left me floored, right? It's not sufficient for me to say, oh, because Modi is in cahoots with Netanyahu and Trump, therefore, and Chinese technology shot some Indian planes down, that means everything the Pakistani state is doing is palatable. No, not for me. So that it's not easy anymore to identify what that alternative future would look like. Not to put words into people's mouths who, of course, preceded me in this struggle in the 20th century. But what I'm actually trying to say is that we need to talk about that future. It's not just sufficient for us to talk about just to critique, just to say this is the system that is brutalizing, it is militarized, it is dispossessing, and it is destroying, our environmental landscapes. That, or even to resist them in the everyday. I'm saying that we need to do that and also take that additional step, even if it's in the realm of the imaginary, because it matters, right, to have an imagination. It matters to say we can potentially imagine. And to go back to where we started, isn't that what the current conjuncture is in a sense infamous for? There is no alternative. That, in Frederick Jameson's words, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than imagine the end of capitalism. And that should change. I think we should find it easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. By the way, the world won't end. Okay, the human species might struggle to survive if it continues on this path, but the world won't end. I don't believe in this we will actually demolish the planet business. Species like ourselves, we are not bigger than this world. And there have been, again, temporality, geological time is something that we cannot even, in a sense, imagine the scale of those temporalities. So I think that we need to start thinking that it is possible to imagine an end to capitalism and to colonial modernity, rather than just assume that what we're seeing now is just going to end up being the end of the world. And that's sort of what I'm appealing to us to do.
With that note of logical hope, I believe there's some of the intellectual pessimism in us perhaps reduces a little bit. And even though it's so difficult, this entire business of identification and the choosing of sides in this fragmented society, I hope we get to talk more over and over and figure out every day in microscopic ways where we stand. So, with that, I think if we have no more questions, that would be the end of today's lecture. We are honored to have you, sir. This is one of the most insightful lectures that we have had. And it is also, like I said, the need of the hour. We need to hear all those voices, we need to learn. So, thank you so much for being here today.
It's very kind of you, and I was very honored to be here with you, and I hope we get a chance to do this again.
Thank you, sir.